The planet had once been beautiful. That was what the older soldiers said when they let themselves say anything
Status
at all.
report, now.
They
Hostile
talked about
advance
the
on
wide
Sector
green
7. Shields
fields that
critical.
used to
Divert.
roll from the
The
eastern
Nexus is
ridgeline
destabilizing.
all
We
the
must
way to the
realign the
Silver
core
Sea,
protocols immediately.
unbroken
Understood.
and easy. The kind of land that made a person feel like the universe had been generous in its design. They talked about the crystal towers of the capital, how on certain mornings the light caught them just right and threw colors across the streets below, like the world itself was showing off. They talked about the open-air markets that used to fill the avenues on warm evenings, the smell of food and the sound of 7 different languages mixing in the air, the way languages do in a city that has had a long time to become comfortable with itself. They talked about these things quietly, and only when they thought no one important was listening, because talking about what a place used to be is a way of admitting you don't believe it will ever be that way again. The fields were ash now. The towers were broken stumps jutting from the ground like the remnants of something that had given up trying to stand. The streets held smoke and the smell of old fire and the constant, never-ending percussion of explosions that had been going on so long that the soldiers had stopped flinching at them. You stop flinching when a thing becomes the background instead of the event. You stop flinching when the normal you are calibrated to has shifted so far from what normal used to mean that the old reactions no longer fire. You get used to almost anything if it goes on long enough. That was one of the harder lessons the war had taught, and it was a lesson that cut in multiple directions, not all of them obvious at first. The war had been going on for 2 years. 2 years of losing. Before the craft came, the Galactic Coalition had been at peace for 400 years. 4 centuries without a war that threatened everything. 4 centuries in which 7 different species, each one ancient and accomplished in its own way, had built something that worked. Not perfectly. Nothing with 7 species ever works perfectly, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never spent time in a room where all 7 of them are trying to agree on anything. There were arguments and trade disputes and the occasional territorial tension that required diplomats to spend weeks in rooms with bad air negotiating compromises that satisfied no one completely. There were philosophical disagreements that ran so deep they occasionally produced crises that looked, from the outside, like they might become something worse. But war, the kind that ends civilizations, the kind that turns fields into ash and towers into stumps and fills streets with the smell that never entirely leaves, that had not come. The coalition had fast ships. It had weapons that could reduce a moon to fragments. It had military commanders who had studied warfare for lifetimes, whose strategic thinking had been refined over centuries into doctrine that was taught to generations of officers across every member world. It had intelligence networks and supply chains and diplomatic frameworks in all the institutional infrastructure that 400 years of peace had given it time and resources to build. For 400 years, none of it had been seriously tested. The craft tested it, and the coalition was failing. The craft dominion was not a nation. It was not a government. It was not even an army in any sense that the coalition's strategists had a ready framework for understanding. It was a hive. Every soldier, every drone, every ship crew was connected to a central thinking network that processed information across the entire force simultaneously, sharing awareness and intention in real time across distances that should have made real-time communication impossible. There were no individuals in the craft, not in any meaningful sense. There was no fear, because fear is a personal thing, and the craft had nothing personal. There was no hesitation, no panic, no confusion at the command level, no moment where the information of a disaster arrived and had to be processed by a mind that was also underneath the processing, feeling the disaster. When 1,000 drones died, the hive calculated the loss and adjusted its plan in milliseconds. Without grief, without emotion, without the fraction of a second delay that comes when a thinking, feeling being has to absorb the fact that something terrible has just happened before it can decide what to do next. They were, in every measurable way, perfect soldiers. The coalition's best strategists had spent months studying the craft, cataloging their behaviors, trying to find the vulnerability that every force, no matter how formidable, was supposed to have. They found patterns, of course. The hive was consistent, almost perfectly consistent, because consistency was a byproduct of centralized decision-making, and centralized decision-making was the hive's fundamental architecture. You could see the patterns clearly. You could predict, with reasonable accuracy, what the craft would do next. Knowing what they would do and stopping what they would do were different problems entirely. The hive's ability to process information and coordinate action across its entire force simultaneously meant that by the time a coalition commander had identified a craft pattern, communicated it up the chain, received authorization for a response, communicated that response down the chain, and seen it begin to execute in the field, the hive had already noticed the coalition's response and adjusted. The information advantage that the craft held was not subtle. It was structural, built into the architecture of what the hive was, and there was no way to fight it with the tools the coalition had available. They had tried anyway, because that was what you did. You tried everything you had, and you kept trying it until the numbers told you to stop, and then you tried to find something the numbers hadn't accounted for. The numbers had not been generous, and they had been winning for 14 months. 9 major battles lost, 3 entire star systems taken, hundreds of thousands of soldiers from 5 different species dead on fields that the coalition had defended and lost and tried to retake and lost again. Supply lines that had been considered secure 6 months ago were now contested or gone. Positions that the senior commanders had privately considered unassailable had been assailed and taken and held. The craft lines moved forward with the slow, inevitable weight of a tide that never got tired, that never second-guessed itself, that never once paused to wonder if what it was doing was worth the cost. On Veilthar Prime, in the ruins of a capital that had once caught morning light and thrown colors into the street, the coalition's senior commanders had gathered. They called it a war council. What it actually was, though no one had said so yet in those precise terms, was a reckoning. Commander Zerath arrived before anyone else. He was Sarathi, which meant he was tall and thin, with 4 long arms and skin the color of polished silver. His species was known across the galaxy for exactly one thing above all else: their minds. The Sarathi processed information the way other species breathed, automatically, continuously, without effort. They could run calculations in their heads that would take a standard computer several seconds to complete. They did not speculate. They did not hope. They did not allow the attractive possibility of a good outcome to influence the calculation of its probability. They worked with facts, and only facts, and they trusted the conclusions that facts produced the way a craftsman trusts a tool that has never failed him. Completely, and without the nagging background question of whether this might be the time it fails. Zerath had been running the same set of calculations for 6 days. He had run them in different orders. He had varied the assumptions in both directions to see how sensitive the conclusions were to the inputs. He had built in margins for error that were more generous than the data actually supported, because he understood that when the answer you keep getting is an answer no one wants to hear, you check your work. You check it again. You try every variation you can think of to see if there is a version of the problem that produces a different result. There wasn't. The War Council chamber filled slowly. Commander Brax of the Velhari arrived next. Broad and blue-skinned, a species that had been fighting wars since before most civilizations had writing, whose physical toughness was matched by a strategic intelligence that had been refined through centuries of conflict on their own world before they ever reached the stars. He sat with the stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to conserve energy in situations where energy would eventually be needed. His face held the expression it usually held, somewhere between irritation and deliberate patience. An expression that had become so constant, it no longer indicated anything specific about his mood, and instead simply indicated that he was present and paying attention. The ambassadors came in after that, representatives from all 7 member species, along with the senior military officers who had been managing what remained of the coalition's defensive posture. Some of them had been fighting this war since the beginning. Some had been brought in more recently to replace commanders who had been lost. All of them carried the particular quality that 2 years of sustained loss produces in the people responsible for trying to stop it. Not defeat, not yet, but something heavier than the simple weight of the work, something that accumulated in the way that compound interest accumulates, steadily and relentlessly and faster than you expect. Last through the door was Ambassador Everett Harlow. Harlow was human. He was a diplomat, not a soldier, which in this room at this moment made him a minority in the most fundamental sense. He had spent 2 years in this war watching soldiers die for ground that kept getting taken back. He had written reports and sent recommendations and sat in rooms like this one while people with more authority made decisions he sometimes agreed with and sometimes didn't, and he had done all of it with the patience that his work required. He was tired, not sleepy tired. Tired in the deep, structural way that comes from watching something go wrong for a very long time without being able to stop it. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix because it isn't made of the same material as sleep. He found a seat and sat down and waited. Zara stood at the front of the chamber and placed his data displays on the table and looked at the room. He did not clear his throat or pause for effect. He did not look for a way into the information that would soften it or prepare the room for what was coming. That was not how the Sarathi operated, and it was not, in any case, the kind of information that had a gentle entry point. He simply began. He showed them the numbers, not summaries, not charts with soft edges and language designed to make a hard thing feel less hard. The actual numbers, precise and complete, laid out in the way a Sarathi lays out anything, without mercy and without apology for the absence of mercy, because mercy applied to information distorts it into something less useful than information is supposed to be. He showed them the rate at which the craft were producing new soldiers and new ships, and the rate at which coalition forces were destroying them, and what happened when you put those two rates on the same graph and extended the line forward in time. He showed them the supply projections, the ammunition reserves, the structural condition of the remaining defensive positions, and how quickly those conditions were degrading under sustained pressure. He showed them the casualty rates from the last 9 battles, including the 3 the coalition had technically won, and he showed them what those victories had actually gone versus what they had actually gained when you ran the numbers honestly and didn't let the satisfaction of having held a position obscure the accounting of what holding it had taken from the force's overall capacity. Then he looked at the room, and he said it, "This war cannot be won." The chamber went very quiet, not the quiet of people thinking, the quiet of people absorbing something they had already suspected but had not yet heard said out loud by someone whose credibility they could not dismiss, in a room where saying it out loud made it real in a different way than it had been real before. He continued. He explained that this was not a question of courage or strategy or the quality of the soldiers doing the fighting. He said clearly, and without any indication that he found the saying of it difficult, that all of those things had been present in adequate measure throughout the conflict. The problem was not human, or Velhari, or Javathi, or any other species in the coalition. The problem was mathematics. The craft hive could replace its losses faster than the coalition could inflict them. Every battle, even the battles that looked like victories on the surface, was a net loss, and the coalition, no matter how hard it fought, was slowly running out of everything. Brack said nothing. He sat with his thick arms crossed and his jaw set and looked at the display screens with the expression of a man who has looked at hard things before and is looking at one again now. Several ambassadors began speaking at once. Some were angry, which is what some people become when they are frightened and do not want to show it. Others were seeking clarification, asking about specific assumptions in the models, suggesting variables that might have been missed, which was the rational response, and also in its own way, a form of the same refusal to accept what was in front of them. One of the Dravathi commanders, an officer who had been fighting since the first craft ships crossed into coalition space, put his head in his hands and went still. Harlow sat quietly and listened to all of it. He listened to the anger and the fear, and the careful, well-reasoned agreement from people who should know, people who had spent their careers understanding exactly this kind of situation. He listened to the debate and the arguments and the suggestions that were really just ways of keeping the conversation going, because as long as the conversation was going, the conclusion hadn't been reached. And he sat with something in him that was, even now, even in this room full of brilliant and experienced minds, all converging toward the same place, not ready to follow them there. He waited until the noise died down. Then he spoke. "There is one option we haven't tried." The room gave him the particular kind of attention that a room gives to a person who has just said something unexpected in a meeting that everyone thought was nearly finished. A sharpening, a collective refocusing. The involuntary alertness of minds that have been preparing to close and are now being asked to stay open a little longer. "There is a species," he said, choosing his next words with care, "on a small planet in the outer reaches of mapped space. They are not coalition members. We've observed them for some time but never formally approached them for military partnership. They were considered," he paused, "not ready. Zareth turned his long silver head toward Harlow. You are speaking of the humans. Yes. A silence followed. Then Brax made a sound low in his throat. Not hostile, just the sound of a mind that had already considered something and set it aside as not worth pursuing. The humans, said Brax. He said it the way you say the name of something you have already evaluated and placed in its appropriate category. They have been a spacefaring species for less than 200 years. Their ships are slow by coalition standards. Their individual lifespan is short. Their population, though growing, is still small compared to any of the great powers in this chamber. They have never fought a war on anything approaching this scale. They have never faced an enemy with this level of technological sophistication. And their military doctrine, such as it is, has been developed in response to conflicts on their own world and in the immediate systems around it, which is to say, in response to enemies who do not in any way resemble the craft Dominion. No, Harlow agreed, they haven't. Then what makes you think they could help where 7 advanced civilizations have failed? Harlow was quiet for a moment. He had spent a long time reading everything available on human history, not just the military records, not just the technical assessments that coalition observers had filed over the years of watching humanity develop from a distance with the patient, clinical attention of a species that has seen many younger civilizations before and knows roughly what the trajectory looks like. He had read the deeper history, the long and complicated and often brutal story of what humans had done to each other and to their own world across the centuries. He had read about the wars and the plagues and the famines and the collapses. He had read about the empires that rose and fell and rose again in different forms. He had read about the times human civilization had stood at the edge of something that looked like it ought to have been the end and had not fallen. There was a story he kept returning to. It was not a famous story, not the kind that ended up in the prominent chapters of history. It was about a small group of soldiers during one of humanity's oldest recorded wars on their own world, outnumbered on a frozen hillside, holding a defensive position through a night so cold that the equipment failed and the communications failed, and the only thing still functioning was the people themselves. They had held the position, not because the numbers supported holding it. The numbers supported withdrawal clearly and unambiguously, not because they had received orders to hold it. The orders had stopped coming when the communications failed, because they had decided to, individually and collectively, in the particular way that a group of people in extremity sometimes arrives at a shared decision without a meeting or a vote or even an explicit conversation. He had read that story 3 times and still could not fully articulate what it told him about the species. He only knew it told him something that the standard capability assessments didn't capture. I don't know if they can help, he said. He said it honestly because Harlow was not a man who pretended to certainty he didn't have, and pretending to certainty he didn't have was not going to serve anyone in this room right now. I only know that we have tried everything we understand, and it hasn't been enough. Perhaps what we need now is something we don't understand. The council debated for 3 more hours. It was not a comfortable debate. There were arguments against the proposal that were reasonable and well-supported, and that Harlow, sitting through them, could not fully counter. The humans were unproven at this scale. Their technology, while not negligible, was behind the coalitions in several critical areas. Their military culture was different enough from any coalition species that integration would be difficult and time-consuming. The probability that they could arrive quickly enough to change the situation meaningfully was not high. All of these things were true. In the end, it was not hope that made them agree to send the signal. It was the absence of anything better. The absence of any other card in a hand that had been played down to almost nothing. The particular calculus of a situation where the expected value of an improbable option begins to exceed the expected value of the probable ones, because the probable ones are all pointing in the same direction. Late that night, a communication was prepared and transmitted across the deep black of space, aimed at a small blue-green world orbiting an ordinary yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. It was a formal request for military assistance, precise in its language, complete in its documentation of the situation, and completely uncertain whether the answer would be yes. On Veothar Prime, the explosions continued through the night. The coalition soldiers held their lines and tried not to think about what the Surathi commander had said that morning. Nobody on the coalition's command deck was expecting much. That was the honest truth of it, and the officers there were professional enough not to pretend otherwise, at least to themselves. When Ambassador Harlow had proposed sending the distress signal to the humans, most of the council had agreed because there was nothing left to argue about. It was not hope that had driven the decision, it was exhaustion. They had tried everything that made sense. The humans were what was left when sense ran out. So when the long-range scanners above Valthar Prime picked up incoming ships dropping out of faster-than-light transit on the edge of the system, the officers on watch noted it calmly, reported it up the chain, and prepared themselves to receive what they imagined would be a modest gesture. A few hundred ships, perhaps, a symbolic show of support from a young species that wanted to demonstrate goodwill without committing to something it didn't fully understand. What they saw made the calmness stop. It was not a small fleet. What came through the transit points was an armada. Not hundreds of vessels. Thousands. They poured into the system in wave after wave, filling the scanner display with contacts until the screen looked like someone had thrown a fistful of sand at it. Officers who had spent careers reading tactical displays stood at their stations and stared, and in some cases said nothing at all for an extended period of time. But it was not the number of ships that made the room go quiet. It was what the ships looked like. Coalition warships were built according to standards refined over centuries of iterative development. Clean lines, balanced proportions, every component designed with careful attention to how it functioned as part of the whole. They were, in their way, beautiful objects. The way anything built with genuine mastery is beautiful. The way a tool that does exactly what it is supposed to do, and nothing more and nothing less, becomes a kind of aesthetic statement about the value of purpose. Human ships were none of those things. They were large and asymmetrical and loud. Some had sections that looked like they had been added after the original construction, extra plating welded on at odd angles, weapon systems mounted on hardpoints that clearly had not been part of the original design, modifications layered over modifications in ways that suggested a process of continuous adaptation, rather than a single act of design. Their heat signatures were enormous. By coalition safety standards, any vessel running that hot would have been grounded until engineering resolved the problem and filed a remediation report. The human ships appeared completely unbothered by this. They ran hot and loud and rough, and they came in fast, and somehow, in a way that the tactical officers watching them could not quite explain, all of it held together. Zerath studied the incoming fleet data with the focused attention of a mind that processes data the way other species process air. Automatically, thoroughly, and without the ability to stop doing it. Survival probability for the lead elements in first contact, under 40%. The ships were wrong in too many ways for the math to be kind. He noted this and did not say it out loud, because the situation did not require saying it out loud, and because there were some things about the next few hours that were, he was increasingly aware, not going to be illuminated by the tools he usually relied on. A communication request came through from the lead vessel, designated by its transponder as the Unbroken. Harlow thought that was a very human kind of name for a warship. Not a name that described the ship's capabilities or its class or its history, a name that described an intention. A name that was, in its own way, a kind of promise. The face that appeared on the screen was a woman. She looked to be in her early 50s, with short silver-gray hair, and the kind of face that had spent a long time in difficult circumstances without being broken by them. Not hardened exactly, not closed, but shaped by the accumulation of difficult things in the way that stone is shaped by water, so that the difficulty is visible in the form without being the whole of the form. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were the color of deep water. Still on the surface was something moving underneath that you couldn't quite track. Her left arm from the elbow down was mechanical, not the polished, life-mimicking prosthetics that some species favored. This was a functional replacement, undecorated and unpretentious, built to work and not to pretend, and she wore it the way she seemed to wear everything about herself, without apology and without calling attention to it. She introduced herself as General Diana Cole, commanding officer of the Terran Expeditionary Force. Harlow introduced himself and began the briefing. He explained the state of the war. He showed her the maps, where the craft lines were, where the coalition's remaining defensive positions sat, which positions were critical and could not be allowed to fall, and which had already been quietly conceded to the advancing enemy. He explained the craft's hive mind structure, their regeneration rates, their documented attack patterns. The tactical behaviors that had been cataloged and studied and that kept working anyway because knowing a thing was coming didn't always help you stop it. He was thorough and precise, and he watched her face as he spoke, because that was what a good diplomat does. He reads the room, he watches for the reaction, he adjusts to what he sees. Most commanders receiving this briefing for the first time went through a visible process. First disbelief, then the controlled expression of someone trying to look calm while absorbing something significantly worse than they had prepared for. Then the careful reassembly of professional composure over the top of both of those things. Cole listened to all of it without visible reaction. She did not flinch at the casualty figures. She did not react to the maps showing how much territory had been lost. She did not do any of the small, involuntary things that people do when information is hitting them harder than they want to show. She just listened, her eyes steady and attentive, until he was finished. Then she asked one question. How long can your people hold the surface if we buy you time in orbit? Harlow glanced at Zerath, who stood to the side of the display, his eyes moving in the particular way they moved when he was calculating. Statistically, Zerath said, no amount of time changes the fundamental outcome. The problem is not one of time, it is one of mathematics. Cole looked at him. A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable, just present, like the space between two notes in a piece of music. Give me a number, she said, not a philosophy. Zerath was quiet for a moment. In his long career, no one had spoken to him in quite that way. Not because it was disrespectful, because it wasn't. Because it was entirely direct in a way that left no space for the kind of qualified, layered response that his usual interlocutors expected and that he was accustomed to providing. 60 days, he said, perhaps 70, under ideal conditions. Good, Cole said. She said it simply, the way you say a word when it means exactly what it means. Then we start now. She closed the channel. The command deck was very still. Then the human fleet moved. They did not form up in organized assault patterns. They did not establish a perimeter or execute any of the careful sequence movements that coalition tactical doctrine prescribed for an engagement of this scale. They went in hard and fast and loud, breaking into smaller groups almost immediately, each cluster attacking from a different angle, communicating with each other in ways that were too fast and too decentralized for the coalition's tactical systems to properly follow. The craft advance fleet, which had been methodically pressing its attack on the orbital defense grid with the patient, grinding efficiency it brought to everything, suddenly had significant threats coming at it from 6 directions simultaneously. The battle was immediate. The craft hit the human ships with the same overwhelming firepower that had broken coalition fleets for 2 years. It was the full coordinated weight of a force that had learned through 14 months of unbroken success exactly how much force was required to break an enemy. The human ships took the hits. Some took them badly. Hulls were breached. Systems went down. From the coalition command deck, officers watching the engagement tracked vessels that by any reasonable assessment should have broken off and were instead still in the fight, still firing, still pushing forward into the craft lines at angles the Hive's predictive models had clearly not accounted for. The craft did something it had not done in months. It adjusted, not dramatically. A full tactical repositioning would have been visible and dramatic, and this was neither. But the Hive shifted, compensated, redirected resources. Small movements that nonetheless represented something significant. The coalition hadn't forced that kind of adjustment since the early days of the war, before the craft had fully mapped their enemies' patterns and made the necessary corrections permanent. Brack stood beside Harlow at the observation window, 2 of his thick arms crossed and uncrossed, a habit he had when he was processing something he didn't have the right words for yet. They actually came, Brack said finally. It was not a compliment. It was not an insult. It was simply surprise, stripped of interpretation, the raw acknowledgement of something that had not been expected, and that was, now that it had arrived, requiring a reassessment of a category that he had thought was settled. Down on the surface of Baelthar Prime, coalition soldiers crouched in their positions and looked up at the sky. The flashes of weapons fire in the upper atmosphere were more frequent than they had been in weeks. More noise up there than anything they had experienced in months. A young Dravathi soldier looked up at the lights in the dark sky above the broken planet. "Who is that?" she asked. The older soldier beside her watched a human destroyer take a direct hit that tore away part of its rear section. The ship did not break off. It did not reduce speed or change its heading in any meaningful way. It kept firing. It kept going. Humans, the older soldier said. Are they going to help? She asked. The older soldier watched for another long moment. I think, he said slowly, they already are. On the Coalition command deck, Harlow stood at the window and thought about that story from human history. The soldiers on the frozen hillside. Equipment failed, orders gone, holding anyway. He had never been able to fully explain what that story told him about the species. He thought he was beginning to understand it now, watching it live, in the shape of ships that should have stopped and hadn't, in the data streams showing a craft fleet doing something it had not been forced to do in months. Zara stayed at his screens until very late that night. He updated his projections with the new data from the first hours of the engagement. The numbers were not conclusive, too early, too incomplete for conclusions. But they were changing in ways his models had not predicted. Small shifts, marginal movements in probabilities that had been locked in one direction for so long that any movement at all was significant. He was a scientist. He did not announce conclusions from preliminary data. He would wait, and he would check, and he would let the data accumulate until it said something definitive. But the expression on his long silver face, as he stood at those screens in the quiet of the late hour, was one that the people who knew him had not seen there in over a year. Genuine attention, the focused, open attention of a mind that has encountered something it does not fully understand and has found, in that incomprehension, something worth examining. The war was not won. It was nowhere close to won. The ground that had been lost was still lost, and the ash on Valthar Prime was still ash, and the cost of everything that still had to happen was not yet knowable. But for the first time since Zarath had stood in front of the War Council and laid out the mathematics of failure, the outcome felt like something other than settled. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the first small, fragile, stubborn beginning of something. The first week was chaos, not the bad kind, or not entirely. It was the kind of chaos that arrives when something genuinely new enters a situation and refuses to behave according to the rules the situation was built around. The Coalition had been fighting this war for 2 years, according to frameworks developed over centuries of accumulated military experience. There were protocols for everything: engagement distances, acceptable unit loss thresholds, clear criteria for when to advance and when to pull back and when a position had become too costly to hold. These protocols had been built by people who knew what they were doing, refined over generations of hard experience, and they were treated, rightly, as the condensed wisdom of everyone who had fought and died learning the lessons that produced them. The humans seemed to have arrived without most of them. Coalition tactical officers assigned to coordinate with human units in the field sent back reports that were, in several cases, more confused than informative. Human squads pushed into positions that the tactical models flagged as not worth taking. They held ground that the mathematics said should be abandoned. They took losses that should, by any reasonable calculation, have forced a withdrawal, fell back a short distance, reorganized in the middle of incoming fire, and came back at the same position from a different angle. It was not elegant, it was not clean. It violated several principles that the Coalition's finest strategic minds had spent careers refining. It kept working, not always, not without cost. The human units bled for every meter of ground the way all units bleed in a war like this one, but they bled forward, which was something the Coalition's forces had not been doing consistently for over a year. Zurath spent long hours in the evenings going through the engagement reports. He was looking for the underlying logic, the systematic principle, organizing the apparent disorder into something coherent. He was certain there had to be one. Every effective military force operated on principles, even if those principles weren't written down anywhere. You simply had to look long enough and carefully enough to find them. After 4 days, he went to Harlow. He stood in the doorway of the ambassador's temporary office and said, with the particular difficulty of a man who is not accustomed to admitting the limits of his own analysis, I cannot find a unifying doctrine. Every unit appears to be making its own tactical decisions in the moment. The pattern should not be coherent. He paused. And yet it is. Harlow looked at him for a moment. And yet, he agreed quietly. Zara stood there a moment longer, as though there was something else he had intended to say and decided against. Then he left. But he came back the next evening, and the one after that, going through the same reports from different angles, looking for the thing he was certain must be there. He was not wrong that it was there. He was wrong about what kind of thing it was. What Zerath had identified, without yet having the framework to name it, was something that coalition military science had never needed to develop a precise vocabulary for, because no species they had studied at length did it in quite this way. Human soldiers did not simply execute plans. They thought while they fought. Every engagement was simultaneously a lesson. They watched what the enemy did, cataloged it in real time, and before a given battle was even finished, the soldiers on the ground were already incorporating what they had learned into how they responded to the next moment. A craft tactic that succeeded in the first hour of an engagement would frequently stop working in the third hour. Not because command had issued revised instructions, but because the individual soldiers who had experienced it had noticed the pattern and adapted on their own, often without discussing it, often without being fully aware they were doing it consciously at all. The craft hive mind was extraordinarily fast at executing a plan. It was not built for building new ones under pressure from an enemy that kept changing in ways it couldn't anticipate. The humans kept forcing it to build new ones. And every time the hive built a new plan and began executing it, the humans were already adapting to the plan before it had fully deployed. It was, Zerath would write later, like trying to hold water in a container that kept changing its own shape. 10 days into the engagement, a coalition medic named Lyra was assigned to work alongside a human infantry unit for field coordination purposes. Lyra was Velhari, broad-shouldered, blue-skinned, physically tough by most galactic standards. She had been in the war for 18 months and thought of herself as experienced in the way that a person becomes experienced by surviving things they were not certain they would survive. She had seen hard fighting. She had worked on casualties that would have finished a less resilient species. The first day with the human unit adjusted her understanding of what experience meant. She watched a soldier named Corporal Dayton Webb take a fragment of shrapnel to the upper arm during a craft advance. Webb sat down behind a section of broken wall, pulled the fragment out with a multi-tool from his kit, packed the wound with coagulant foam from the medic pouch on his vest, and wrapped it tightly with a compression bandage. Then he stood back up and kept firing. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. He did not call for a medic. When Lyra moved toward him to assess and assist, he waved her off without breaking his firing rhythm and pointed toward a soldier further down the wall who was in significantly worse condition. She filed a report about it that evening. In Velhari military protocol, a wound of that severity triggered mandatory removal from active duty pending medical evaluation. The shock response alone was considered sufficient to compromise combat effectiveness for a minimum of several hours, regardless of the physical damage. She had seen seasoned Velhari warriors need full medical intervention for less. She wrote in the report, "The human soldier did not appear to experience the wound as an interruption. He appeared to experience it as an inconvenience." This was not an isolated observation. She saw it again and again in the days that followed. Human soldiers had a relationship with physical pain that she could not fully account for from a medical standpoint. They felt it. She could see clearly that they felt it. She was a medic, and she knew what a body in pain looked like at the physiological level. The small tells that the body produces when it is dealing with damage, whether or not the mind is attending to them. But they did not allow it to make decisions for them. They felt it, registered it, filed it somewhere internal that was not the part of them driving their actions, and kept going. It was as though somewhere in the long, complicated history of their species, humans had developed the capacity to put pain in a separate room inside themselves and lock the door when there was still something that needed doing. The pain was real, the room was real, the lock was real. But the room was not the room where the decisions got made. She wrote that in the report too. The report made its way through the coordination channels and eventually reached Harlow's desk. And from there, at Harlow's suggestion, it was passed to General Cole. Cole read it alone, standing at the narrow window of her planning room aboard the Unbroken. She read it once, then read it again. She stood at the window for a while after that, looking at nothing in particular. Or perhaps it's something specific that was not visible to anyone but her. In her other hand, the one made of flesh, she held the current casualty list. Her fingers had tightened around it enough that the edges of the paper bent slightly inward. She did not say anything about what she felt. She rarely did. What affected Lyra most profoundly, though, was not Webb and the shrapnel. It was what she witnessed on the 14th night. There had been a bad afternoon. A human platoon holding a ridge against a craft assault had fought for 6 hours and held the position, and in doing so had lost nearly a third of its soldiers. The ridge was held. The craft advance in that sector had been stopped. By the metrics of the war as it had been going, these facts represented something close to success. That evening, Lyra observed the surviving soldiers and waited for the standard response that coalition protocol prescribed after significant losses. Withdrawal to a rear position, medical and psychological evaluation, structured rest, the careful process of rebuilding unit cohesion before returning to the line. Instead, the soldiers built a small fire. It was in a sheltered area behind their position, low enough and shielded enough not to be a tactical liability. They sat around it, not all of them at once. Some rotated through, some stayed longer than others, some sat in silence, and some spoke. But at the center of what they were doing was this. They said the names. Each soldier who had died that afternoon. Each one named specifically, completely. Not as a number in a report, not as a line on a casualty list, by name. And then they talked about those people. Small things. The kind of things that don't make it into any official record. A running joke that had gone on for weeks, a habit someone had, a story from before the war, something small and personal in particular to that person in the way that all the things that make a person themselves are small and personal in particular. Things that existed only in the memory of the people who had been present for them, and that would disappear from the world entirely if the people in that circle did not say them out loud. One soldier cried. He did not hide it, and nobody looked away. The soldier beside him put an arm around him and stayed there and said nothing, just stayed there, which was exactly the right thing and required no explanation. Then they slept, and in the morning they were back on the line. Lyra sat in her temporary quarters and tried to write a report about what she had seen and found that she did not have the right language for it. In her species, the kind of loss that platoon had taken required weeks of structured recovery before a unit was considered combat ready again. She had seen coalition soldiers, experienced, decorated warriors from species far older than humanity, require extensive intervention after losing half what this unit had lost. She had seen soldiers who were, by every objective measure, fine, unable to perform, because the weight of what they had seen and survived had lodged itself somewhere in their functioning and was not shifting. These soldiers had grieved at night and gone back to work at dawn. She wrote, after a long time trying to find the right words, "They move through grief the way a river moves through stone, not around it, through it. The grief is real, the loss is real, and they carry both of those things back to the line with them in the morning, and the weight of them does not slow the movement. I do not understand this. I am not certain it can be understood from the outside. But I have spent 14 days observing it, and I am certain that it is the most significant thing I have seen in 18 months of war." She sent the report up through her chain of command. On the other side of the battle lines, something was happening that had no precedent in the history of the craft Dominion. The Arbiter was struggling. The Arbiter was not a commander in any sense the coalition would have recognized. It was a biological node, one of the rare specialized components of the craft hive that existed at a level above ordinary drone coordination. Its function was not to receive instructions and execute them. Its function was to observe, assess, and generate strategic adjustments when the standard predictive models required high-level recalibration. It had performed this function many times across many campaigns. It had never in those campaigns encountered a problem it could not resolve within a predictable time frame using the tools the Hive had built and refined over centuries of warfare. It had never needed to perform it like this. The Arbiter had analyzed the human tactical pattern for 9 days and had arrived at a conclusion that its modeling systems could not resolve into anything actionable. The humans were not behaving consistently enough to be modeled with sufficient accuracy for predictive countermeasures to function at the level the Hive required. The craft's greatest military asset, across every campaign it had ever fought, was its ability to predict what an enemy would do and position itself accordingly before the action occurred. Against every species it had faced, this had worked with near-perfect reliability. Coalition species were disciplined, well-trained, and consistent. Consistency was a vulnerability. It meant your patterns could be learned and exploited, and that you could not change those patterns fast enough to avoid the exploitation once it had begun. The humans were not consistent, not because they were disorganized. They were not disorganized, but they made individual decisions constantly at every level of their force structure, and individual decisions at the scale of thousands of soldiers created a pattern that looked, to the Hive's modeling systems, like noise. Signal and noise had always been separable in every previous engagement. With humans, the noise was the signal. The arbiter processed this for a long time, running variations, testing alternative modeling approaches, consulting every available data set on human behavioral patterns that coalition observers had compiled over the years of watching humanity from a distance. Then it did something that had never been done in the history of craft military operations. It ordered a targeted psychological campaign. The logic was clean. Every species the craft had fought had a breaking point where the visible cost of continued resistance became too high for individual soldiers and unit cohesion to maintain. Watching companions die in close proximity was the most reliable trigger for that breaking point across every species the hive had documented. The arbiter understood exactly how to exploit it, how to structure attacks to maximize casualty visibility, how to sustain pressure at the precise frequency that prevented recovery and kept cumulative loss at the forefront of conscious experience, how to make the ongoing cost of fighting feel unbearable in a way that no amount of training or doctrine could fully counteract. This had worked on every species. The craft attacked accordingly. They hit human-held positions with concentrated fire designed not just to break the defense, but to ensure that the dying was visible to as many surviving soldiers as possible. They targeted positions where unit cohesion was established and loss would therefore be felt most sharply. They sustained the assault at a rhythm calculated to prevent recovery, to keep the wound fresh, to ensure that every soldier in every human position was continuously confronted with the evidence of what holding their ground was costing. The humans became angrier, not louder. Angrier in a way that showed in the hardness of their defensive positions, in the ferocity of their counterattacks, in the complete, total refusal to give ground that should, by the arbiter's calculations, have already been abandoned. The thing that was supposed to break them was making them hold harder. The arbiter processed this result for an extended period. It ran the data against every behavioral model it had. It checked its assumptions. It ran the data again. Then it generated a query, an upward communication to the broader hive network, something the arbiter level had never needed to do, because the arbiter level was supposed to be the source of answers, not the origin of questions. The query moved through the network. It said, these organisms respond to loss with increased resistance rather than decreased capacity. The mechanism is unknown. The pattern does not conform to any documented behavioral model in the archive. The campaign is producing the inverse of its intended effect. What are these creatures made of? No response came back. The hive did not know. General Diana Cole called the meeting at 3 in the morning. That alone told the senior coalition officers something about the woman. She did not call meetings at 3 in the morning because she had lost track of time or because she worked without regard to other schedules out of self-importance. She called them at 3 in the morning because she had been awake since the previous morning and had spent all of those hours working, and when she finally had something that was worth saying, she said it immediately and without apology for the hour, because the hour was not the point, and everyone in the room was professional enough to understand that. Harlow arrived still adjusting his jacket. Zerath arrived looking as he always looked, precise, contained, giving nothing away in his bearing that he had not chosen to give away. Brax arrived looking irritated, which was still his default expression and still did not mean much. Several other senior coalition officers filled the remaining seats around the long table in the briefing room aboard the Unbroken. Cole was already at the front. Behind her, a large display showed the craft fleet formation, the dense, organized mass of vessels that had been pressing the coalition's orbital defenses for 2 years. In the center of the formation, marked in red, was a single vessel significantly larger than the one surrounding it. The craft command ship, Cole said. She pointed at the red marker and began without preamble. Everything the hive does in this system runs through that ship. It is the central relay for all hive mind communications across this entire battle zone. Every order, every tactical adjustment, every coordination signal that keeps those drones operating as a unified force passes through it. It is the reason they function the way they do, the reason they've been nearly impossible to outmaneuver, because they're not operating as separate units. They're operating as a single organism, and that ship is the component that makes them a single organism rather than a collection of parts. She paused and looked at the room. If we destroy it, and she said, the forward fleet loses coordination, not permanently. The hive will reroute through secondary channels eventually. The architecture exists. It's just not designed to carry this volume of command traffic as efficiently as the primary relay does. But the window that destruction creates, even a few hours of a disorganized craft fleet, is enough to break their orbital line completely. Once the orbital line breaks, the ground assault loses its above-atmosphere support, and your surface forces can advance and push them back. The room was quiet. Zareth spoke carefully. This approach has been considered previously. The command vessel sits at the center of their formation. The surrounding fleet density makes any direct approach statistically unsurvivable. No ship that enters that corridor comes back out. Not a ship, Cole said. She changed the display. What appeared was not a broad fleet assault approach. It was a single narrow path threading through the craft formation between the largest concentrations of enemy vessels. A line so thin, it was almost invisible against the scale of the fleet surrounding it. A strike team, she said. Small insertion craft, low signal profile. They go in during the rotation window in the command vessel's defensive screen. Every 7 days, the outer sensor coverage has a gap. 40 minutes where a small, low-emission vessel has a viable insertion path. They penetrate to the command vessel's outer hull, breach it, and destroy the relay core from the inside. Another silence, longer this time. Brax leaned forward. The survival probability of such a mission is very low, Cole said. She did not dress it up or soften the language. I know what the numbers are. Then you know we cannot ask soldiers. I did not ask, Cole said. The room waited. I informed my people of the mission and what it required. I described the objective, the method, the approach corridor, and the defensive environment inside the target vessel. I made the probability of return completely clear to every individual, in plain language, with no ambiguity. I said most of you will not come back. I said it clearly enough that there could be no misunderstanding. Then I asked for volunteers. She reached forward and changed the display one more time. A number appeared on the screen, 4,312. Nobody spoke. The number sat there in the light of the display, and the room sat with it and tried to hold the full weight of what it meant, which was difficult because the full weight of what it meant was larger than the space available for things that can be held. That is how many soldiers volunteered, Cole said, after I told them the odds. After I told them that most of them would not come back. After I told them that the mission parameters allowed for a maximum of 216 personnel across 44 insertion craft, which meant that even if every volunteer was accepted, the majority of them would be turned away. She let that settle. 4,312 people put their names on the list. I had to turn most of them away because there was not enough room. Harlow stared at the number for a long time. He tried to hold the image in his mind, standing in front of thousands of people, saying, the probability of survival is less than 2%. Most of you will not come back. Raise your hand if you are willing. He tried to imagine what the room would look like if every single hand went up. He could not fully hold it. It was too large for the space his mind had available for things he understood. Zareth stood at his station and looked at the number on the display. His calculation reflex, the automatic reach toward quantification that governed his entire relationship with information, reached for this number and found nothing it could work with. There was no model in his archive that produced 4,312 as an output from those conditions. He had spent a career trusting that everything could be expressed in terms mathematics could process. He was looking at something that mathematics could accurately report and could not explain. He did not say anything. The plan was approved before the sky outside began to lighten. They had 6 days. The 7-day rotation cycle of the command vessel's defensive screen meant the next viable insertion window opened in 6 days. The 40-minute gap in sensor coverage was the only moment the insertion craft had any realistic chance of approaching undetected. Miss that window, and the next one was 7 days further out, and there was no guarantee the defensive positions on the surface would hold for 7 more days of sustained craft pressure. 6 days to prepare 216 people for something that most of them would not come back from. Cole spent most of those 6 days in motion. Planning sessions, equipment checks, briefings with the insertion team commanders, coordination meetings about the surface advance that needed to be ready to launch the moment the orbital line showed weakness. She moved through all of it with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything, making decisions that required making and deferring the ones that could wait. She slept 3 hours a night. Harlow knew this because he was not sleeping much either, and the Unbroken was not a large enough vessel for a person awake at unusual hours to be unaware of who else was awake. He passed her twice in the corridor in the middle of the night. Each time she was carrying the insertion team manifest, the list of 216 names. Each time she acknowledged him with a brief nod and kept moving. He understood what she was doing with the list. He understood what it meant to carry the names of people you had just sent towards something you knew most of them would not survive. He had never commanded anything larger than a negotiating room, and he still understood it because some things about leadership do not require direct experience to recognize. Some things communicate themselves through observation alone, if you are paying the right kind of attention. You carry the weight of it before it happens, because after it happens, you will not have the luxury of wait. After it happens, there will be the next thing that needs doing, and the thing after that, and the work will not wait for you to feel what you feel. So you feel it now at 3 in the morning in a corridor with the list in your hand before the window opens and the insertion craft launch, and the mathematics of probability begin to do what mathematics does without sentiment or delay. You feel it now so that you can function then. That was what the list was for. Not to memorize, though she had memorized it. Not to review, though she reviewed it. To carry. To let the weight of 216 names settle into you before the event rather than after it, so that the event finds you already bearing the weight and does not need to stop you to give it to you. He did not stop her. He let her carry the list through the quiet of the ship. In the engineering bay, 3 decks below, Sloane Merritt was still awake. She had been awake for most of the past 6 days. Merritt was 24 years old. She had gone directly from an accelerated engineering program into the expeditionary force, which meant she had never had the experience of ordinary professional life between her education and a war. She did not know in the way that people who have had that experience know what ordinary felt like. She had come from a classroom to this, and this had simply become her normal. A normal that included sleeping 4 hours a night and spending the remaining hours talking to equipment the way some people talk to stubborn animals. Firmly and with an underlying affection she would not have admitted to out loud. She worked on the relay disruption device with the focused single-mindedness of someone who understands that the thing in their hands is the most important thing they will ever build and is treating it accordingly. The device needed to do one thing: interrupt the hive mind relay signal at the source at the moment of physical contact with the command vessel's core relay housing, and sustain that interruption long enough for the structural collapse of the relay architecture to become self-propagating. Hit the system hard enough that the system cannot recover before the damage becomes irreversible. She finished it on the 6th day, 2 hours before the insertion window. It was not elegant. It was held together in 3 places by manual fasteners and in one place by a length of high tensile wire that had no business being inside a piece of military-grade hardware. A coalition technician examined it and wrote in his assessment, structurally irregular, methodology unconventional, component integration non-standard. Then he ran the functional test. He sat for a moment after the results came back. Then he added, performance output nominal, device operates within required parameters. Recommend deployment approval. He did not know what else to write. The night before the launch, Harlow walked through the staging area where the insertion teams were making their final preparations. He was a diplomat in a space built for soldiers, and he knew it. But Cole had not told him not to come, and so he came, and he walked quietly through the organized activity of 216 people doing the methodical work of people who have accepted what the next hours are going to require of them. Near the end of the bay, he found Callum Rhodes. Rhodes was 19 years old, from a small coastal town in Maine, where the Atlantic came in hard off the water, and the winters were long, and the people who stayed learned a particular relationship with difficulty that the people who left sometimes didn't. He was not the largest person in the staging area, or the most decorated, or the most visibly experienced. He was sitting on his equipment pack with the specific quality of stillness that is not the absence of thought, but the presence of it, turned inward, quiet. Sergeant Slade Ellis was sitting beside him. Ellis was 26, had been fighting for 6 years, had the particular economy of movement that comes from having learned exactly how much energy anything requires and refusing to spend more than that. Harlow stood nearby for a moment. Rhodes looked up and saw him and did not seem surprised to see a diplomat in the staging area at this hour. "You doing all right?" Harlow asked. Rhodes thought about it genuinely, in a way that indicated he was actually considering the question rather than reflexively answering it. Yeah, he said. I think so. Why did you volunteer? Harlow asked. He had been asking this question of human soldiers whenever the opportunity arose, because he was still trying to understand the thing he had been trying to understand since before the signal was sent. Rhodes was quiet for a moment. Seemed like the right thing to do, he said, simply, without additional architecture around it. The way a person states something that is to them self-evident. Harlow nodded. Ellis opened one eye, regarded Harlow for a moment, then closed it again. Whether she was sleeping or simply conserving energy for what was ahead, it amounted to the same thing. He walked back through the staging area, through the controlled activity of 216 people who had heard the odds and raised their hands anyway, and up to the observation level where Cole was standing alone, looking out at the stars. She did not turn when he approached. They stood together for a moment in the silence of the ship, looking out at the dark, at the distant cluster of lights that was the craft fleet surrounding the vessel that held the thing that kept the war going the way it had been going. The window opens in 4 hours, Harlow said. I know, said Cole. The mechanical hand rested against the viewport, fingers slightly open, neither gripping nor releasing. Her eyes were on the distant lights of the craft fleet, and whatever she was feeling lived behind them in the place where she kept what she kept. The place she had learned, over years of doing this work, to keep sealed during the hours when there was still work to do. 4 hours later, the insertion craft launched. 44 small, dark shapes dropping away from the unbroken into the black, running minimal power, running quiet, threading toward the gap in the sensor coverage like needles threading through a closing eye, carrying 216 people whose names Cole could recite from memory, into the dark. The 44 insertion craft went in dark, no running lights, minimal power signatures. They moved through the gap in the command vessel's sensor coverage the way water moves through a crack in stone, not by force, but by finding the exact shape of the opening and fitting themselves to it. The window was 40 minutes. They had calculated and recalculated, and the number that kept coming back was 40 minutes from the moment the first craft entered the corridor to the moment the sensor rotation completed and the gap closed. 40 minutes to cross the distance, penetrate the hull, reach the relay core, do what they had come to do. On the bridge of the Unbroken, Cole stood at the tactical display and watched the 44 contact points move across the screen in real time. Each point was a craft. Each craft was a number. The numbers moved slowly, steadily, in the particular silence of a room where everyone present understands that speaking will not change anything, and so they do not speak. Harlow stood to the left of the display. Zerath stood to the right. Brack stood further back with his arms crossed and his eyes on the screen with the focused attention of a man who has seen enough of war to know exactly what he is watching, and who is watching it anyway, because looking away would be a different kind of failure. At the 8-minute mark, 3 of the 44 contact points disappeared. Not damaged, not diverted, gone. The sensor return simply stopped, which meant the craft had stopped, which meant the people inside them had stopped, and the stopping was permanent. Cole's mechanical hand tightened against the edge of the console. She did not look away from the screen. 41 points continued moving. The inside of the craft command vessel was nothing like any human ship. The corridors were narrow and low and built to the proportions of the craft drone form. Efficient in the way that a machine is efficient, every dimension calculated to serve function with no material spent on anything else. The lighting was dim by human standards, a frequency spectrum calibrated to the craft's sensory range, which meant the insertion teams were moving through something that felt, to human eyes, like the deep end of twilight that never resolved into either dark or light. The defenders were immediate. There had been no illusion, in the briefing rooms or the staging areas or the quiet conversations of the night before, that the approach through the sensor gap would mean an uncontested insertion. The gap was an external detection. Inside the vessel, the hive knew the moment the hull was breached at 7 separate points, and it responded the way it always responded, without hesitation, without the fractional delay of individual decision-making, with the full coordinated weight of every available defensive unit converging toward the breach points simultaneously. The fighting in the corridors was close and loud and constant. There was no room for the fluid, adaptive tactics that had given the human units their advantage in open-field engagements. The corridors reduced everything to its most fundamental elements: who was willing to keep moving forward and who wasn't, and how long each person could sustain that willingness against what was coming at them from the other direction. The advantages of human unpredictability compressed under these conditions into something simpler and more brutal. 216 became 180 in the first 20 minutes, then 140, then fewer. The numbers dropped in the way numbers drop in close quarters fighting, not in a steady trackable decline, but in sudden clusters, when a corridor junction went wrong or a defensive position proved stronger than the approach allowed for. Between the clusters, there were stretches of movement in the specific kind of focus that combat produces, which is not the absence of awareness, but the narrowing of it to the dimensions of the immediate moment, the next door, the next corner, the next thing that needs to happen. Callum Rhodes moved through it the way he had been trained to move through it, and beyond what training could account for, he moved through it the way he had always moved through difficult things, by not stopping. He had grown up in a place where the weather came in hard, off the Atlantic, and the only real response was to put your head down and move through it, because the weather was not going to stop and standing still in it was not a strategy. He did not think about this consciously. He just moved. He lost the first member of his fire team at a quarter junction 12 minutes in. He lost the second 8 minutes after that. The third made it another 10 minutes before a defensive position at a pressure door ended it. Rhodes kept moving, not because he had stopped feeling the losses, not because the weight of them was absent or manageable. He kept moving because the relay corps was still ahead, and the relay corps was the reason all of them were here. And the reason they were here was the reason they had volunteered. And the reason they had volunteered was that it had seemed like the right thing to do. And nothing that had happened since entering this vessel had changed what was right. He reached the relay core chamber with 11 others. The chamber was larger than the corridors, a vaulted space at the structural center of the vessel, dominated by the relay core itself, a column of interlocked components rising from floor to ceiling, approximately 4 meters in diameter, humming with the continuous low vibration of something carrying enormous amounts of information at enormous speed. The sound it made was not quite mechanical and not quite organic. It was the voice of the hive's coordination made physical and audible, the voice of the thing they had come to silence. The defensive force inside the chamber was dense. What followed was not a battle in any structured sense. It was the brutal, close, disorganized violence of too many people in too small a space with too much at stake for either side to operate with anything resembling elegance. It lasted less than 4 minutes and felt much longer. When it was over, there were 4 of them standing. Rhodes, a staff sergeant named Ren Gallagher, who had been fighting for 8 years and had the particular quality of stillness under pressure that 8 years of fighting either builds or destroys. In Gallagher, it had built something considerable. A specialist named Marcus Thorne, 23 years old, from a small town in Colorado he had mentioned once during a pre-mission briefing, and a corporal named Fletcher Oakes, whose name Rhodes had learned 3 days ago and whose face he would remember for the rest of his life. The relay corps hummed in front of them. Gallagher reached for the activation device, the trigger for the disruption unit that Sloan Merritt had spent 6 days building, now secured to the equipment harness on Rhodes's chest, because Rhodes had been designated as the primary device carrier and nobody had changed that designation when his fire team was reduced from 4 to 1. Her hand stopped. The trigger housing had taken a hit. The external casing was intact, but the internal mechanism, the remote activation circuit that was supposed to allow the device to be triggered from a safe distance while the carrier moved to an exit point, was not responding. Gallagher ran the check twice, fast, with the efficiency of someone who has been trained to assess damage quickly and without hope coloring the assessment. She looked at Rhodes. He understood what the look meant before she said anything. "Remote trigger is gone," she said, flat, informational. The device still worked. The disruption unit itself was functional. Merritt had built it with enough redundancy that a hit to the trigger housing had not compromised the core mechanism. It would do exactly what it had been designed to do. It would silence the relay core and everything connected to it. It just needed to be activated manually, from contact range with the core, which meant the person activating it would not be stepping back from the activation point before the disruption event. The 4 of them stood in the humming chamber, with the relay core in front of them and the corridor behind them, and the particular kind of silence that falls when a group of people has simultaneously understood something that none of them want to be the first to say out loud. Rhodes looked at the device on his harness. He looked at the relay core. He looked at the three people standing beside him. Gallagher with 8 years of experience in a unit she would go back to, Thorne with the name of a town in Colorado and a life still mostly ahead of him. Oakes, whose name Rhodes had learned 3 days ago and who deserved to have more than 3 days with someone who knew his name. Rhodes was the youngest person in the room. He was the device carrier. He reached up and unclipped the device from his harness, and the movement itself was the decision, made before he had consciously completed the sentence that would have announced it, because that was how the right things sometimes worked. You were already doing them before you knew you had chosen to. "Get out," he said. He used a specific tone of voice, not loud, not dramatic, the tone of someone who has already resolved the question they are answering and is now simply communicating the resolution to people who need to hear it clearly enough to act on it without argument, without hesitation, without the time that argument and hesitation would require. Gallagher looked at him. Thorne looked at him. Oakes looked at him. There was a moment, not long, the situation did not permit long, in which the three of them held what was in front of them. Then Gallagher put her hand on Rhodes' shoulder for exactly 1 second. She did not say anything. She had been fighting for 8 years, and she understood that there was nothing to say. She turned and went. Thorne followed. Oakes was last through the door, and he turned back once, and the look he gave Rhodes was the look of someone committing a face to permanent memory, because that is what you do when you leave someone behind who is choosing to stay. Then they were gone. The corridor beyond the door was quiet. The relay core hummed. Callum Rhodes, 19 years old, from a small town in Maine where the Atlantic came in hard off the water, and the winters were long, and the people who stayed learned something important about staying, stood alone in the chamber at the center of a craft command vessel and looked at the device in his hands and crossed the distance between himself and the core and did what needed doing. What happened in that chamber in the following 90 seconds was witnessed by no one who survived to describe it in specific terms. The command vessel went dark, not damaged, not reduced to partial function, not fighting through secondary systems or rerouting around compromised sections. Dark, completely, all at once. A dead thing floating in space where a living thing had been, and the silence of it was total and immediate and unlike anything that had preceded it in 2 years of war. Cole saw it on the tactical display as a contact that simply stopped being a contact. For 1 second, she did not move. Then, like a wave expanding outward from the point where a stone drops into still water, the effect moved through the craft fleet. Ship by ship, sector by sector, the coordinated, precise, devastating machine of the craft, Dominion's forward fleet came apart at its seams, not explosively, not in the manner of something panicking or failing catastrophically, in the manner of something that has lost the signal that told it how to be a single thing and has reverted, without that signal, to being many separate things that no longer know what the other separate things are doing. Ships stopped firing. Drones drifted. Attack patterns that had been executing with mathematical precision for months simply ceased. Mid-execution, like a sentence interrupted before the period, hanging unfinished in the air. The craft fleet did not descend into chaos. Even without the relay coordination, the individual components of the hive retained their base functions. They did not crash into each other or fire randomly or behave in ways that were structurally destructive. They simply stopped being coordinated. And a force built entirely around coordination, whose entire tactical architecture depended on every component knowing at every moment exactly what every other component was doing, that force, without coordination, was not the same force at all. On the Coalition command deck, a Dravathi officer at the back of the room made a low, deep sound. It was the sound his species made in moments when what they were feeling exceeded the capacity of ordinary expression. Not a word, not quite a cry, but something in between that communicated the size of what was felt without trying to contain it in language. A Velhari officer beside him picked it up, then another. Then a human officer near the front let out a sound that was entirely different in timbre and register and completely identical in meaning. Brax uncrossed his arms. He had kept them crossed through the entire watching, through the insertion, through the contact points going dark one by one, through the long suspended wait between the last craft reaching the command vessel and the moment the command vessel stopped. He had kept his arms crossed because that was what Brax did when he was holding himself still against something large, when he needed to not react until he knew what he was reacting to. He uncrossed them now. Zara stood at his station and looked at the display. The tactical picture in front of him was changing faster than it had changed in any engagement in the 2 years of this war. The probability distributions that had been locked in one direction, the models he had built and refined and checked and trusted through 14 months of the coalition losing ground, they were shifting. Not gradually, not incrementally. In large, visible, undeniable steps toward outcomes that his models, 72 hours ago, had assigned probabilities so low, he had not considered them worth tracking. He looked at the dark shape where the command vessel had been. He looked at the drifting, disorganized remnants of what had been, 30 minutes ago, the most effectively coordinated fighting force the coalition had ever faced. He looked at the numbers. Then Commander Zeroth, whose species bowed only in the presence of death that was genuinely and irreducibly great, only in the presence of something that had earned the acknowledgement in the fullest possible sense of the word, turned toward the dark space where the command vessel floated silent in the field of stars, and he bowed. He held the bow for a long time. Nobody in the room said anything. Nobody needed to. On the surface of Valethor Prime, the craft ground units, cut off from the orbital fleet above them, receiving no updated coordination from a hive mind that was scrambling to reroute through secondary channels not designed to carry this volume of command traffic, fell into patterns that were rigid and predictable in a way they had never been before. For 2 years, the craft ground forces had been nearly impossible to outmaneuver because outmaneuvering them required staying ahead of a predictive system that updated faster than any individual commander could respond to. Now the predictions were old. The updates were slow. The seamless, continuous adaptation that had made them so formidable was still there in fragments, in local clusters. But the system-wide coherence that had made those fragments into a single unified machine was gone. The coalition's surface forces pushed. Human units that had been fighting continuously for 2 weeks pushed hardest, which was remarkable and was noted by every coalition officer watching the advance, and was not remarked upon by any of the human soldiers doing it, because to them it was simply what the situation required, and there was nothing remarkable about doing what the situation required. By the end of the first day after the command vessel went dark, the craft had abandoned the capital district. By the end of the second, they had pulled back from the eastern ridgeline. By the end of the third, they were gone from Valethor Prime entirely. The withdrawal was slow and orderly. The craft did not panic. They were not built for panic. But it was withdrawal. It was the first time in 2 years that the direction of movement in this war had reversed. The first time in 2 years that the line had moved the right way. The planet was not healed. It would not be healed for a long time. And the people who understood these things said so honestly rather than offering comfort that was not yet warranted. The fields were still ash and the towers were still broken stumps and the streets still smelled of old fire in a way that might take years to fully leave. The damage of 2 years does not undo itself in days. But the explosions had stopped. For the first time in over a year, the sky above Valethor Prime was quiet. People came outside and stood in the streets and looked up at it. Some of them did not know at first how to hold the silence. They had lived with the noise for so long that the absence of it felt structural, like a pressure that had always been there and whose removal left the body unsure of how to stand without it. They stood in the quiet and waited for the feeling to catch up to the fact, and slowly, one person at a time, in the particular way that enormous things become real, it did. Cole did not celebrate. She had never been a person who celebrated while there were still things to do, and there were a great many things to do. The surviving insertion team members needed to be recovered. 15 of the 216 had made it out of the command vessel before the disruption event, and they were in the process of being retrieved from the approach corridor where their emergency beacons had activated. Among them were Gallagher, Thorne, and Oakes, the 3 people who had walked out of the relay core chamber at Rhodes's order. They were alive. They would carry what had happened in that chamber for the rest of their lives, which were lives that existed, at least in part, because of what a 19-year-old from Maine had decided in the 90 seconds after they left the room. The dead needed to be formally accounted for. The fleet needed damage assessment and repair prioritization. Supply lines to the surface needed to be reestablished under conditions that were finally no longer hostile. There were coordination meetings and logistics reviews and medical assessments and after-action reports and all the detailed, necessary work that follows any operation regardless of how it went. Harlow found Gallagher on the second day, sitting alone in a corridor near the medical bay, with her arms resting on her knees and her eyes on the middle distance. He sat down beside her. "He told us to go," she said after a while. She did not say who she meant. There was only one person she could have meant. "I know," Harlow said. "I've been in the field for 8 years," she said. "I've made decisions that cost people their lives, decisions that I had the authority to make and the training to make, and that I made correctly by any measure anyone would apply. And I have never—" She stopped. She looked at her hands. He was 19 years old. Harlow did not say anything. He had learned over years of diplomacy that there were moments when the thing a person needed was not a response, but a presence. And this was one of those moments. Gallagher was quiet for a long time. "He knew exactly what he was doing," she said finally. "He knew, and he did it anyway. And he did it like it was simple." She paused. "It wasn't simple." "No," Harlow agreed. "It wasn't." She nodded once slowly and then stood up and went back to work, because that was what she had come here to do, and there was still more of it to do. Harlow sat in the corridor for a moment longer after she left and wrote 3 sentences in his notebook, and then he went back to work too. She moved through all of it with the same steady efficiency she had brought to every other phase, checking items off the list that existed primarily inside her own head, talking to her officers in the short and direct way she always talked to them, making decisions that required making and deferring the ones that could wait. Harlow watched her work. He had been watching her for weeks and still found, each time he looked, something he had not previously cataloged. The way she moved through a room full of people who needed things from her, giving each of them exactly the amount of attention the thing required. Nothing more and nothing less. And moving on, and the people she left behind somehow felt not shortchanged but exactly served. The capacity to do that, to make people feel fully attended to in the brief time you give them, was rarer than most people understood. He had encountered it perhaps 3 times in his career before now. He approached her on the 4th day, when the immediate operational demands had settled enough to allow conversation of a non-urgent kind. "The Coalition Council wants to formally acknowledge what your people have done," he said. "There will be a ceremony, the highest military honor the Coalition can give to a commanding officer." Cole looked at him. "The names of the insertion team," she said. "All of them. I want them read aloud at the ceremony. Every single name in full, without abbreviation. Not a number on a screen, not a summary line in a document. Names." Harlow held her gaze. "That is 201 people." "Yes," she said, "it is." He nodded slowly. "It will be done," he said. She went back to her list. The ceremony was held 2 weeks later in the largest hall that the Coalition's temporary command installation on Velthar Prime could provide. Every senior officer and ambassador of every Coalition species attended. The hall was full in the way that formal halls are sometimes full and sometimes merely occupied. Full in the way that means every person present has understood that they are present for something that will matter beyond the occasion of it, something that will continue to matter after the occasion has become memory, and the memory has become history. The Human Expeditionary Force was represented by Cole and a small group of officers who stood together in their worn, functional uniforms and looked slightly uncomfortable with the formality in the particular way that people who have been doing hard work look when someone puts them in a room with polished floors and asks them to stand still for an extended period of time. Harlow gave a speech. He had written it carefully, with the diplomat's instinct for language that says what it means without saying more than it means, and with something that went beyond craft, the particular weight that comes to words when the person writing them has spent weeks watching the events they are trying to describe and understands, from the inside, what those events actually cost. He spoke about what the Coalition had faced and what it had believed about the situation in the months before the humans arrived. He did not soften it or frame it with the comfortable language of retrospective confidence. He said plainly that they had given up, that the most capable military and strategic minds the Coalition had produced had looked at the situation and concluded it was finished, that they had sent the signal not because they believed it would work, but because they had run out of anything else to try. He said this not as a confession of weakness, but as necessary context, because the only way to understand what the humans had actually done was to understand how completely impossible it had seemed. He said that he had spent 2 years trying to understand something about humans that did not have a name in his language. He said he was not certain he had fully understood it even now. He said only that he had watched it operate and that it had changed what he believed was possible, and that he did not think he would spend the rest of his life without thinking about it. Then the names began. A reader stood at the front of the hall and read them one by one. 201 names, human names from towns and cities across a country on a small blue-green world. Names from places that most of the coalition species present had never heard of and could not pronounce with complete accuracy, but tried to pronounce anyway, because the trying was part of what the reading was for. The trying was the acknowledgement that these were specific places, and these were specific people, and the specificity mattered. The hall was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Not the quiet of waiting, the quiet of receiving. Each name arriving in the air of the room and being held there for a moment before the next one came. Each one an acknowledgement that a specific and particular person had existed, had made a choice with full knowledge of its question was gone, and that the specific and particular shape of who they had been was worth the time it took to say their name out loud. It took a long time. Nobody left. Nobody checked a device or leaned to speak to the person beside them. Every species in that room, each with its own relationship to death and its own rituals for honoring the dead, sat in the common language of attention and listened to every name as it was called. Because attending to each name was the minimum that each name was owed, and everyone in that room understood this even if they had not articulated it. When the last name was read, Cole walked to the front of the hall. Zerath presented the coalition's highest military honor with a formality that was, for the Sarathi, also a kind of feeling, the precise, controlled expression of a species that did not have easy access to sentiment, and so expressed it through the rigor of ceremony instead, through the accuteness of the ritual, through the care taken with every element of the presentation as a way of communicating what could not be communicated through the expression that came naturally. The honor was a small thing, simple in design. It carried the weight not of its material, but of what had been decided it meant, which across 400 years of coalition history had made it mean something real. Cole held it in her mechanical hand and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at the room full of species who had been at war for 2 years and were not at war anymore, at least here, at least today. "Thank you," she said, simply, without elaboration, the way she did everything. She returned to her place. Back on Earth, there were no grand parades. There were small things. Towns held quiet ceremonies in parks and public squares on ordinary afternoons. The kind of ordinary afternoon that exists because of what those people had done. Though the people going to the grocery store 2 blocks away were not thinking about this and didn't need to be. Schools observed moments of silence. In a coastal town in Maine, in a square near the water where the Atlantic wind came in steady off the sea, a gathering of people who had known a 19-year-old boy stood together and said his name, and did not try to make what had happened to him larger than it was, because it was already large enough to need no addition. Families lit candles in windows for people who were not coming home. The news covered the victory with the full register that events of this scale produce: the official statements, the expert analysis, the retrospectives, the careful political accounting of what it meant and what came next. All of the formal apparatus of a civilization processing something significant through its public channels, which is necessary and right and is also not the same as the thing itself. The thing itself moved through communities differently. It moved in conversations, in the things people said to each other in ordinary places, at kitchen tables, on front porches, in the parking lots of grocery stores, where 2 people who knew each other stopped for a moment longer than the task required. In the particular weight that certain sentences carried when the person saying them had recently come to understand what it actually costs to hold a line and what it actually means when someone decides to hold one anyway. In the stories that parents told their children, not as heroic legend, not as the simplified, sanitized version of events that makes history comfortable for young ears. As true stories, with the complexity and cost and moral weight that true stories carry, told to children because children are the people who will grow up inside the world that the events made possible, and they deserve to understand what the world they live in was purchased with. A generation grew up knowing the names. Callum Rhodes, Sloan Merritt and the device held together with wire that worked perfectly, Slade Ellis and the 6 years behind her and the nod she gave a boy who said it seemed like the right thing to do. Ren Gallagher, who had been fighting for 8 years and put her hand on a young man's shoulder for 1 second before she turned and went. General Diana Cole standing in the dark on the bridge of the Unbroken, with her mechanical hand on the console edge, watching the signals go out one by one and not looking away. And 4,312 hands raised in a room after being told the odds. They grew up understanding, in the particular way that children understand things they are shown rather than told, things that become part of how they see the world before they have the language to describe what they're seeing, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when the situation requires it. Not because they are fearless. Every one of them had been afraid. Not because they did not know what they were walking toward. They had been told exactly what they were walking toward. They walked toward it anyway, because it seemed like the right thing to do. In the years that followed, the coalition military added a new course of study. It was officially classified as a course in human combat psychology and tactical methodology. In practice, it was something harder to define precisely, an attempt to understand, systematize, and teach something that resisted systematization by its essential nature, that kept slipping out of the containers that academic language tried to put it in. The scholars who wrote the earliest drafts of the course materials found themselves revising sections repeatedly, not because their research was incomplete, but because the categories they were using kept proving insufficient. Human military behavior, they kept discovering, did not sit comfortably inside the frameworks that coalition military science had developed to describe the behavior of other species. It required new frameworks, and building new frameworks was slow work that occasionally felt like trying to catch rain in a colander. But they kept at it. That was, Harlow noted in a margin comment on an early draft, perhaps the most human thing about the whole enterprise, the insistence on continuing to try to understand something even after repeated encounters with how difficult the understanding was going to be. Zarath contributed to the course materials in his retirement. He had left the coalition military 3 years after the battle in a departure that was, for a Sorathi, unusually ceremonial. He spoke for a long time in his retirement address about how the war had changed his understanding of what the word variable meant in its deepest sense. He said he had spent his entire career trusting mathematics, and that he still trusted mathematics. But he had learned that there were variables which did not appear in equations, things that could not be measured in advance and therefore could not be included in any model built from advanced measurements. He had watched these variables operate. He had seen what they produced. He would not, he said, make the mistake of leaving them out of his calculations again, now that he knew they existed and understood something of how they functioned. He did not give them a name. He said only that he had seen them, and that seeing them had been sufficient. The course materials grew over time. The primary text eventually ran over 900 pages, covering everything from human physiological pain response to battlefield adaptation to the social rituals that soldiers use to process loss and return to function. The small fires, the spoken names, the arm around a shoulder in the dark. It was dense and thorough and deeply researched, and it was taught at every coalition war academy within a decade of its first publication. The conclusion of that text, written by a panel of the coalition's most respected military scholars after years of collaborative research, was surprisingly short. It said, "No model sufficiently captures it. It must be witnessed." Harlow's own report, completed 6 months after the battle, became required reading alongside the course text. He had written it in the careful, precise language of a diplomat who understands that his job is to describe what he has seen without overstating or understating it, and who has learned over the years that the discipline of that restraint is not a limitation but a form of respect for the subject. The report covered tactical observations, biological notes, cultural analysis, historical context. It was thorough in the way that he was thorough about everything. The line that was quoted most often, the one that ended up on the wall of the War Academy's main entrance, rendered in the original language Harlow had written it in, alongside a translation in each coalition language, in letters large enough to be read from across the room, was near the end of the document. It said, "Humans do not fight because they believe they will win. They fight because they cannot accept not trying. This distinction is, apparently, the most dangerous force in the known galaxy." Far in the future, decades after the battle, in a time when the craft dominion had changed and the galaxy had changed with it in ways that the people who had fought the war would not entirely have predicted and would not entirely have recognized. A young craft scholar sat in a university classroom on a world that had once been a battlefield. She was studying the history of the war, specifically the Battle of Valthar Prime, specifically the moment the command vessel went dark and the fleet that had been winning for 2 years stopped winning. She had read every analysis. She had studied the tactical records and the engineering assessments and the casualty figures and the strategic retrospectives written by everyone who had been involved and many who hadn't. She had read Harlow's report 3 times. She had read the 900-page course text cover to cover. She had read Zerath's retirement address and the transcripts of interviews conducted with surviving insertion team members in the years after the battle. She kept coming back to a question that none of it quite answered. She stayed after class one afternoon and raised it with her professor, an old academic who had spent his career studying the history of the war from both sides of it, who had devoted his life to understanding an event he had not lived through, but that had shaped the world he lived in, and whose age meant he carried the subject the way people carry things they have lived with long enough for the carrying to become invisible. What is the human word, she asked, for the thing that made them fight like that, the thing the hive couldn't model, the variable that Zerath said couldn't be measured, the thing in Harlow's report that he says no model sufficiently captures. There must be a word for it. What did the humans call it? Her professor was quiet for a moment. He had been asked versions of this question many times over the course of his career. He had given several different answers depending on who was asking and what he thought they were actually trying to understand. Some versions of the question were asking about tactics. Some were asking about biology. Some were asking, beneath the academic framing, something more personal. Something about what it feels like to keep going when the numbers say stop. Something that had less to do with historical analysis than with the particular situation of the person asking it. He thought about what this version was asking. He thought about Callum Rhodes, 19 years old, from a town by the sea in Maine, standing alone in a chamber at the center of a craft command vessel, with a device in his hands and 3 people walking out a door he had told them to walk out of. He thought about what that moment had required of a person who was, by every standard assessment, ordinary, who had no extraordinary qualities listed in his service file, who had signed up and done his training and carried his weight and had not asked for recognition and had raised his hand after hearing the odds because it seemed like the right thing to do. He thought about 4,312 hands. He thought about a platoon of soldiers sitting around a small fire saying the names of people they had lost, and then sleeping and waking up and going back to the line. He thought about what holds a person together when the mathematics of the situation have finished making their case, and the case they have made is that there is no rational basis for continuing. He thought about what you call the thing that decides to continue anyway, not in defiance of reason, not in ignorance of the bomb, but with full knowledge of both, and continuing regardless, because not continuing is a thing that cannot be accepted. They have many words for it, he said. They always have. They are a species that has always had more words for the things that keep them going than for the things that stop them. That tendency shows up in every period of their history, in every language they have ever spoken. He looked out the window at the sky above the world that had once burned. But the one they come back to, he said, the one that sits at the center of all the others, the one that is simple enough to write in a notebook and complicated enough to spend a lifetime trying to fully understand, it is a small word. The scholar waited. Hope, he said. She wrote it down. She looked at it for a moment. One small word, 4 letters, the kind of word that looks almost too small to carry what it is apparently expected to carry, that looks, on the page, like it should be the beginning of a sentence rather than the answer to a question. Then she looked up, through the window, at the wet and quiet sky above a world that had once been a battlefield and was now just a place where people lived and went about their days. None of the people walking below the window were thinking about the war. None of them were thinking about the cost of the sky being the color it was, the cost of the quiet being as quiet as it was, the cost of the ordinary afternoon being as ordinary as it was. They were thinking about the ordinary things that people think about in ordinary time, what needed doing, where they were going, the unremarkable texture of a day that was not on fire. That was, perhaps, the whole point. The ordinary days are what the extraordinary ones are for. The professor gathered his papers slowly, with the unhurried care of a man who has learned not to rush the ends of things. Outside, the world went on, unheroic, unhurried, alive in the specific and irreplaceable way that things are alive when someone, somewhere decided that the cost of protecting that life was a cost worth paying, and paid it, and did not require the world to remember them in order for the decision to have been the right one. One small word, written in a notebook by a scholar on a world that used to be a battlefield, sitting in the light. Like a thing that had always been simple,